So I'm starting my own furniture making business, and this table I'm building will be my first piece for sale. There's just one problem though. I don't have a client. Nobody has asked for this table, and I'm building it with the hope that I can find a buyer after the fact. In almost every way, this is a terrible idea. But I'm going to do my best to try and convince both you and myself really, as to why building furniture with no client might not actually be the worst idea for me. My very sharp scrub plane didn't want anything to do with this wood, and that's because the wood I'm using for this tabletop is ridiculously hard and dense. I'm going to have to experiment with techniques and maybe resort to some electricity to make anything out of this wood, because it's quite difficult to work with. So far I've been marking out and proceeding to flatten some of the slight wood movement in the slabs. Usually I'd never recommend using a belt sander for this task, but I found in this case it was actually my best option. On most types of wood, a belt sander would be too aggressive of a tool, but not here. I'm really not sure why, but for some reason the timber supplier I bought these slabs from had used polyurethane on one side of the slab. They also make tables, but this slab was still in a rough condition, so I'm guessing they just wanted to see what it looked like with finish. In any case, it gives me a good excuse to show you how to take this plastic garbage off the wood. This is a carbide scraper and it makes quick work of removing finishes like this. I then hit it with the belt sander and that got it back to normal. Something I had to contend with was learning how to best take the bark off these slabs. It took me quite a few attempts of screwing around to try and find a half-decent method. And I think it's pretty obvious that I'm struggling here. I had a bit of luck with going to the edges and leveraging the bark up in sections. Bark tends to peel off the wood as it dries, so I think I also got luckier with that on this end. I resorted to being a caveman for a moment when I thought I could do a section with my own strength. Kind of pointless compared to using a chisel, but it felt satisfying. This bark was really interesting to me because of the way it basically forms in ribbons. The whole tree is like this actually, and once it's finished, the surface of the wood is pretty amazing, because as the grain dips and dives all across the flat surface, it reflects light in some really dynamic ways. But also on the edges of the slab, the wood ends up having tons of ripples and waves that look incredible in my opinion. So I'll do my best to preserve them. I used a brass brush to remove the rest of the bark. I'd definitely not recommend using this on softer woods though, because it can leave deep and unnatural scratches. On these slabs though, the wood is hard enough to resist the worst of it, and the scratches are otherwise left mostly to blend in with the natural contours. I used several different files to wear down these protruding nubs. I'd like to keep the edge profile natural, but unsurprisingly people want to run their hands along features like these. As such, I'll try and make sure the whole thing is comfortable to touch while keeping these details. After the wire brush, I use a nylon wheel that has embedded grit to sand the edges. This has a minor cosmetic benefit, but mostly it just makes everything smooth to the touch. For softer woods, which is pretty much every other wood, this would be my go-to edge cleanup. It's a new tool to me, but I can already tell it's invaluable for live edge work. I've pretty much finished the rough work for the first slab for the table. So now I'm going to repeat the process on the second. Oh, and if I hadn't mentioned already, this wood is hard and dense, which means it's heavy as hell. Just one of these slabs alone really isn't enough to create a table, but if I join them I can get the required width. And I think in joining them I can make something really unique. I feel like I should actually explain what I'm working with here. This timber is Coolabah. For wood there is a rating for hardness called a Django rating. A Django rating can give you a general idea on what a wood might be like to work with. For context, pine and fir tend to land between 400 and 700 pounds force, black walnut is at 1k, spotted gum, which is one of my favourite Aussie timbers, is at 2.4k, and this wood, being Coolabah, is right near the top of the scale at 3.7k pounds force. At this rating, Coolabah is only slightly harder than EP and pretty much bang on for Brazilian ebony. With that being said, trying to build a table out of this wood had me buggered. On this slab, one of the tree branches had snapped off, which leaves an incredibly interesting feature that I want to include in the finished table. It does need some addressing however, as the break is both sharp and has fragile sections. I'm ultimately trying to remove any loose material and smoothing out what's left without losing too much character. Getting the live edge completely cleared of bark was a meticulous task. I found it was so easy to miss spots in all this texture. So I spent a good deal of time finding the last of it with a keen eye and by touch before I would let myself move on. In a few places, the texture of the edge had been damaged from when the slab was harvested and moved, so I used a wire brush to cut away the softer fibres and try and blend some texture back in. Because I have a small obsession with hand tools, I really want to try card scraping these slabs to a finished surface. So this is my really quick guide to setting up a card scraper. I start out by removing the previously set cutting burr with the diamond stone. Once I can feel that it's gone, I grind the card at 90 degrees on the stone to flatten the edge and prepare it for a new burr. When the edge is flat and ready, I put the card into a homemade clamp, and then this clamp goes into the bench vise. This will hold the card steady while rolling the cutting edge. Putting a bit of oil on the burnisher helps it to glide smoothly and also establish a consistent burr. You want to put light pressure on the card and slightly angle the burnisher as you go. Do enough passes until you can feel that the metal has folded over. Repeat for both sides, and when you can feel it catching under your fingernail, that's a good sign. It's a bit of trial and error trying to get a good cutting edge, so don't feel bad if you don't get it straight away. Now, you don't need this, but I've made a simple jig to hold the scraper, so my thumbs don't get tired while trying to do a full table. And this right here is part of why I like this tool so much. It is so damn satisfying to scrape up shavings of wood. And I also think it's probably a little bit more interesting to watch these shavings get pulled up than to see me sand these slabs instead. Because of course the key benefit to using a card scraper is that it can leave a finish ready surface. Additionally, card scrapers work better with harder woods and are able to pull up great shavings where they might instead catch or tear on softer woods. So I thought it would be the perfect tool to use for this wood. Card scrapers are also super versatile when it comes to wood with inconsistent grain direction like this. For example, if I tried to use a hand plane on these slabs, there would be absolutely no hope, as the plane blade would dig into the grain in places and ruin the surface by causing tear out. I've been card scraping the bottoms of the slabs because it's easier to do most of that work now. But the tops need a lot of work done, so I'll save scraping those for a little bit. I want to join these slabs together. This is not exactly going to be an easy feat, and probably something I wouldn't recommend without some experience. Not that I feel that I have that much, but the previous desk I worked on was a bit of a setup for this. These two slabs are Coolabah from the same tree and are sequential cuts, meaning at one point they were together in the tree. Typically, when woodworkers get slabs in sequence from a tree, the idea is to create a book match. A book match being where both slabs mirror each other's grain pattern when placed side by side. That's not really possible with these two slabs in my opinion. It can be done, but if it were to be done, the design would seem forced, I think. And I think in doing a book match, I'd be leaving a better option on the table, if you'll pardon the pun. I'm orientating these slabs in a different way instead for two key reasons. Number one, I get the most surface area on the top of the table with them this way around. Because they were both cut from close to the edge of the tree, the outer edges have pretty significant slope. So having them flipped this way removes that as a problem. And number two, the smaller slab nestles very nicely into the larger one in this orientation. And between them then, there will be a fairly consistent but natural gap that will become a main design feature for the tabletop. I'm currently rounding and sanding all of the edges while it's still easy to do so. A card scraper wouldn't do too well here. So working through the grits is the best way to deal with these corners. Keeping with the more natural theme, I'm not trying for something that looks like a manufactured edge, so doing this by hand actually works well in my favour. But what you've been seeing me do so far is all the prep work for getting these slabs to sit even better together. I've been running a saw down between the slabs to take off small amounts of touching materials so that I can bring the slabs even closer together. I'm not looking to have no gap at all, but there were some sections that if left alone would have made the gap even larger than I would have liked. I found the best way to do this was to start big on the saws and work my way down to the more flexible ones once the bulk of the material was gone. I'm not gonna lie though, this was very tedious, but I think the end result was well worth it. The slabs were having a bit of a disagreement on this end, so I clamped them in alignment while marking out for some bow ties. I'll use bow ties as one method for joining the two slabs together. I've got a couple more methods, but you'll have to wait to see those. I couldn't get my hands on any more Coolabah, so for all the remaining wood for this table I'll be using red gum, which still complements the Coolabah quite nicely, but also gives a bit of extra variety to the piece. I'm cutting the blocks I marked out to a more reasonable size. With that done, it's easier for me to figure out what sort of angles I want for the bow ties. Then I can run them through a jig that I've made on my table saw that will cut them out most of the way. I find this works pretty well unless you need to make a really long bow tie. I did the cleanup with a chisel, but I should have actually sawn these down the rest of the way by hand. I say that because the wood ended up tearing out in the corners because it is so hard. I didn't expect that to happen at all, but looking back I probably should have. It's all really hidden in the end, but still something to learn from. These marks help me keep the same alignment when I put the bow ties back in later. It's really important these blocks don't move while marking out the cut, so I CA glue them in place temporarily. I use a marking knife to transfer the shape onto the slabs. I actually prefer to angle the knife in a little bit, just to make sure the joint is tight. The glue easily comes off with twisting force, so a tap of the mallet does the job. I establish the depth of cut with a brad point bit, and then use the same hole to begin routing from. I found it was really hard to see the cut lines, so I used a pencil to mark that out. For these bow ties, I'm doing as few as possible to join the slabs. I think bow ties can look really nice, but when there are too many used in sequence, it pretty much always looks awful in my view. When placed along a crack or join and there are many of them together, it looks like a zipper or something, and I hate that look. Also, by only using very few bow ties, I'm hoping the top of the table looks enigmatic and more impressive, specifically because there are so few points holding the slabs together. I'll get into why I'm building this table without a client. First, I just want to say what I'm doing here, trying to build a really unique piece for sale and hoping to find a buyer afterwards, is incredibly risky and in many ways just a dumb way to try and start business. I more than recognize all that, but I do think I have some good reasons to try anyway. I believe what I value most about doing it this way is the freedom it provides when it comes to creativity and design. I really want to be constantly evolving my processes, ideas, and maybe even try and push some boundaries with this sort of furniture. And I want to be able to experiment until I establish something of my own style. You can of course try and do this with client work, but it would be a slow process of trying to push each consecutive client into an unproven idea while also trying not to get stuck making the same proven thing over and over. It's a matter of self-fulfillment. I know I'll likely need to charge less for my work for the option to do this, but I'd much rather that than to get held up doing one thing constantly and/or end up losing the freedom I value in the design process. Another big reason I do not want to build furniture for clients is to do with these videos. I'm essentially using whatever platform you're watching this on as a marketing tool for my work. But to go with that, the possible revenue I could end up making from these videos has the ability to far outscale what I can make by hand. But if I can earn enough through these videos, it gives me the option to create weird things that don't even necessarily need to be sold. And I love the idea of that. I'll say that's a pipe dream at this point though. But in terms of these videos and clients, for YouTube specifically, the most important factor I'd say in making a successful video is having an interesting idea and how that idea is conveyed to drive traffic through the packaging of the title and thumbnail. Having to build a piece for a client makes it so that the design idea is retrofit into a video idea, rather than the idea itself being part of the genesis of the video and the packaging for it. Don't get me wrong, both options can be successful or flop, but I think for me, having the framework of generating a design idea hand in hand with the video to be much smoother. And doing it this way also lets me make the more eccentric things that I think are more likely to be clicked on. I had a fair bit of trouble with chopping out these bow ties. The corners were really fragile and I had to be careful to ensure they didn't break off, and yet it still occurred a couple of times. I found I had to chop into the piece in a way that the wood fibers were supported by backing material, which made this a slow process. When bringing the slabs back together, I was a little nervous the bow ties might not align again, but I shouldn't have been worried. The care I took previously while marking out paid off. Chamfering the bottom of these bow ties helps with alignment when replacing them. It also makes it easier to drive them in later. I made this small bow tie to stabilize a crack at the crotch of the big slab. I also think this was a nice one to include because it's not obvious like the others unless you spend more than a moment with the table, so it's something extra to be discovered. Placing some sawdust at the edges of the hole should cover up gaps and hopefully reduce any glue squeeze out. When chopping the hole for the bow ties, I try to make the bottom ever so slightly wider than the top. This is so it's easier to hammer in. But because of the way I was joining these two slabs, it was always going to be hard to drive in regardless. Hitting the bow tie would jam in place and knock the slabs out of coplanar. So in the moment, I found I had to hit the bottom of one slab to bring them back into alignment. A little bit of glue and sawdust should hide imperfections in the joint, but honestly most of this got scraped away later, so I could have skipped this step. I did originally want this bow tie to have quite a bit of depth to it for strength, but there wasn't all that much material in the slabs to sink into here. So that's why there's a fair bit of excess left on top once it's driven in. Given everything I ended up doing to the table, I'd still say this joint ended up plenty strong. At the other end of the table, I wound up with a gap between the slabs, but adding another bow tie felt out of place to me here when in relation to the others. But I still needed some sort of strong joint. So I opted for something I've never done but I've wanted to try for a while, a patchwork inlay. As I was starting with the first patch, I stabilised this nearby corner with CA glue at the same time. The patches that bridge the gap should form a really strong joint, and I figured too that the straight cut edge that will be at this end of the slab would work well with blending with a series of rectangle inlays. I realised while I was marking the first block that I'd actually get a better reveal on the patchwork at the edge of the table if I cut it to size now, so that's what I'm doing. And keeping with the theme of figuring things out as I went, I didn't even consider until cutting into them that these slabs were more than the max depth of my track saw, so I had to finish the cuts by hand. I make sure to support the offcuts here so they don't fall early and leave me with torn out fibres on the bottom of the table. About the patchwork, from a design perspective, I also saw this end of the slab top as the visually heavier and less organic side of the table, so to me it made sense to lean into that with the inlays. Because this inlay will be visible from the side and top, it was a challenge for me. Also, clearing out the waste from the edge of the table into the end grain was somewhat difficult as the wood would tend to want to split out. But with the waste material removed, I did a test fit and was pretty damn happy. So I decided to glue it into place. I watched a Paul Sellers video a while back where he recommended using a palette knife for spreading glue on hard to reach joints, but I've actually found it to be a great tool for spreading glue in general. I'd recommend giving it a try, and they're a cheap tool too, so there's not much harm if you don't like it. I had a small but really annoying mistake where some wood fibres chipped out in the corner of this joint, so I jammed some more fibres in during the glue up to try and hide the blunder. While I waited for the first patch to dry, I came back to glue in what's probably my favourite bow tie in this whole table. In addition to creating a strong connection between the slabs, I also wanted to display some skill with the patchwork. So I aligned two of the blocks to touch at their corners. Getting this point to look really sharp should make the inlay more impressive and let me show off a bit of craftsmanship. Similarly, I was trying to make sure all the geometry on these lined up, as it could look really sloppy otherwise. I tried to go relatively small with the patchwork on this table because I was well aware that if I did much more it might seem really out of place and overpowering to the rest of the design. Although I really would like to do a full table with many more of these as a key design focus and really lean into it. What I've done here is good practice, but really it's only just barely scratching the surface of what a patchwork inlay could be. I think with what I've done with this table, the patchwork ends up being an interesting difference to the bow tie connections, and there's enough separation between them on top for the difference in joinery not to clash too hard. I really like these, but I will say one downside to doing them that I quite dislike is the glue drying period before you can do overlapping patches. That drying time can really slow down a project. After getting most of the patches in, I went back to finish off the work on the bow ties I put in earlier. Something I quickly want to say about using a belt sander to flush up these inlays is that you need to be incredibly careful while doing it. I'm trying my best to get even pressure over the length of each one and then flipping to sand with the grain direction of the slabs once it gets close, but it is so easy to mess this process up and make an ugly groove in the tabletop if you're not careful. On this last patch, I included a block with a gum vein. I don't really see people doing these with imperfect blocks because I guess it defeats the purpose when it comes to using them to hide defects in a slab, but I actually really like the way this one turned out, and I think I'd definitely consider using odd pieces if I was to do this again. It might seem strange, but I do quite enjoy the defects that are included in live edge timber. The defects make it way more exciting to me than perfect boards, so I guess it makes sense that I like it in the patches as well. I'm nearing the end of the work for the top of the table, so I'm trying to get it all finalised now so I can flip the piece and work on the underside. I use these nylon brushes to sand the hard spots. To remove the heavy sanding marks from the belt sander, I used an orbital sander on low grit. I'm going to card scrape the tops to a smooth surface, but I had previously found the card scraper struggled to remove the deep scratches left by belt sanding without unreasonable effort. I'd need to do more testing, but I also think that scraping this wood in particular, when it had a rougher surface, was much more damaging to the burr of the scraper, meaning I'd need to reset it more frequently, which is pretty annoying. You may notice I swapped using the card in my hand, and that's to get better control towards the end, and also for a wider shaving that serves to avoid ridges in the finished surface. At this point, I wasn't 100% pleased with the finish after the card scrapers, so I ended up experimenting off camera, and you may be able to see that here. I started with the 000 steel wool to burnish the whole surface. I then repeated the same process with quad 0 steel wool. This process reduced the track marks the card scraper leaves and also took the surface to a higher sheen. Steel wool doesn't quite abrade like sandpaper, so I believe it's not necessarily removing the previous effort of scraping. I then tried something I've known of but never really done, which is to use paper to basically polish the wood. I'm not sure I'd recommend doing all this, but it seemed to work pretty well in this case. I'm also still figuring out my whole finishing process, so I can't say if I do any of this again. Flipping these slabs might have been one of the more stressful moments of my life. I've cut this sequence down from a whole 5 minutes of footage if you'd believe it. All I'll say is I've already started to make plans for building a winch for flipping these in my workshop. These wheels I purchased for the live edge actually doubled as a really good glue removing tool for these spots. I'm honestly not even sure how I would have removed the glue otherwise. Another way I'm going to ensure these slabs stay together and get the support they need is with some sliding dovetails. On the last desk that I built, I cut the dovetail groove walls completely parallel, but with this one I tried a slight wedge shape, and let me tell you that is the goddamn way to go. Getting the dovetails to fit was so much easier as the mating pieces don't really bind in the groove until it gets to the end, meaning there is so much less adjustment to get the joint finished and tight. I'm going to go off on a tangent for a minute, but hear me out. When it comes to making furniture with live edge slabs, there's a design limiting factor that isn't as present as when working with milled boards to create furniture. Because so much of the appeal in this style of furniture is in keeping the natural shapes of the wood in the finished piece, I find that a slab often has only a few ways to be used effectively. Where in comparison, dimensioned lumber is more of a blank slate to be worked with, and I'd say has less of a predetermined best use case. I actually really enjoy working with slabs for this reason. Because of how unique each slab can be, it often feels like the wood almost tells you what it wants to be, and you're just working through the steps to get it there rather than forcing a design upon it. With these two slabs, for instance, I actually had a very different design in mind when I went to the store to purchase them, but upon seeing them I knew that what I had in mind was not what was best for them, and that instead I'd be doing something very different than I had originally planned. Doing work for clients while working with live edge slabs makes things a bit more difficult. I can sit here and say that a slab tells you what it wants to be or whatever, but that doesn't mean jack if a client comes to you with dimensions and something they want, because you need to be accommodating to that first, of course. I realized while working on the previous desk I made for a friend that to do live edge work with a client, the best course of action is to shop or pick a slab together with the client, because in this way you can hopefully both perfectly fill the client's demands and also respect what the wood should become. This is so much harder to do with someone you don't know, however, and I can hardly ask a stranger to come slab shopping with me at this point, and I can't purchase and store a large number of slabs to have on hand to sort through with a client. What I'm hoping for with this table is to turn the slabs into what I best see them as, and then have faith that there is someone out there that sees this and finds what I've made to be perfect for them. Which is risky, but I think it's a good option assuming it works out. These are working sketches I made to try and figure out the table legs. When I started this build, and even up to this point, I didn't really have an idea of what I wanted to do with the table legs for these slabs. Okay, well, that's not true. I had a semblance of an idea, but I wasn't sure how I was going to execute it. Basically what I wanted was to lean into the shape of the slabs on top and do something asymmetrical with the legs on either end of the table. At the bottoms of the slabs, there's a clean cut across the trunk, and I thought it made most sense to make the base at this end very visually heavy. This heavy base could then juxtapose the legs on the other end of the table, which would be lighter and branch out at angles to thematically match the slab tops at this end, which also branch out. I just had two problems with all this. One, I've never done anything like what I'm thinking, and two, whatever joinery I end up using must be able to be disassembled for delivery, while also being really strong. Pretty easy, right? For this table base, I was really hesitant to use more live edge. I think using too much live edge can make the overall piece really tacky, and with this furniture you almost need a more manufactured base to balance out the organic shapes of the slabs on top. For a base like this, that would mean cutting the edges square on both sides of the slab, but unfortunately I didn't have a wide enough slab for that. I opted to bring some geometry into the base instead. I thought it would be a good idea to let the gap between the slabs on top inform this one and extend that into the design for the base, which was quite an experimental move, but I think it actually worked out pretty well. At the bottom of this wedge cutout, I also placed a circle, so the wedge cut couldn't potentially split the wood at its point. This slab needed a bunch of surgery. It was a challenging bit of wood with all sorts of problems, namely some decay, a massive open gum vein, and some loose pieces. Which may make you question why I chose it, but I think some of these defects, particularly the decay, make this slab stand out from others. All the light colours of the decay were really attractive to me because they contrast nicely to the deeper reds of the slab. And when you're trying to make a piece that stands out, features like these make the job so much easier. With all the cracks running through this piece, I wasn't comfortable leaving it without some bow ties for structural support. I played around with arrangements and sizes to conclude with what I have here. There were going to be many visual points of interest on this slab face, so I figured that the arrangement of the bow ties was going to be really important. Likewise, I chose to use the size of each bow tie to form a hierarchy of importance as another design strategy for these. I think usually I wouldn't use so many bow ties in such a small area, but this slab really needed it, and these sorts of tactics were my way of making it work. Given I don't know where this table will end up, I decided to do bow ties on both sides of this table base. In the somewhat likely case this table ends up against a wall, the bow ties I'm about to cut won't be visible, but the previous ones will still stand as a feature. But if the table's not against a wall, and the outer bow ties of this slab are visible, they will be very prominent, so I wanted to show off with these ones. I've not done a double bow tie like this before, but I've always really liked how they look. And I really don't think there's much practical reason for doing two in a row like this. It's just about looks in this case. I found they're not really much harder to do than a single bow tie. The only things to look out for are leaving enough room when you're marking them so you can actually get the marking knife between both, though you could do one at a time I suppose for a tighter fit. And other than that, paying close attention when placing them before marking to ensure everything lines up nicely. I used red gum for the bow ties and the cooler bar slabs on top of the table. But I did the opposite here and I made the most of the small offcuts from the cooler bar slabs that I had and made bow ties for this red gum slab. They have very similar red tones that work quite well together I think, but they're also different enough to not just blend together and be unnoticeable. I didn't want this table to be a wobbly one, so I took this cut from the base so I would have two clear contact points on this end. I really wasn't paying enough attention when cutting this out though, and I cut into material that I wanted to keep. I then thought to myself, maybe if I do both sides I'll make it look like an intentional detail, but I think deep down I already knew this wouldn't work. My cuts weren't perfect, so I used a belt sander to fix up this face. I tried some glue and sawdust to see how well I could hide the mistake, but glue always dries darker, so this was a long shot. I had to do some sanding on the wedge and circle cuts, and while I was doing that I realised the answer to my sticky situation was staring me in the face. If I already had this circle at the point of a wedge, another one on the slab would look perfectly intentional, so that's what I'd do to hide the mistake. The only problem I found with this solution was trying to line the hole up with the existing cut, but using the belt sander I fudged it into looking normal I think. I didn't give this slab the same card scrape surface as the top because the decayed sections are softer and I don't think they would have taken that tool very nicely. Instead I sanded to 240 grit and burnished with quad zero steel wool. A nice thing about the sliding dovetails is that before you make them permanent, they're totally removable. Meaning I can take these out of the table and do the remaining work with ease. So I can still shape these rails, and for the slab base I'm also adding holes for furniture bolts, and this will be one of two attachment methods I'll use. This table was my first time using furniture bolts on a project, so I was a bit nervous for this. I knew all the theory to installing them, but of course in practice there's always things to learn. I transferred marks onto the slab with a brad point bit inside the holes I previously made on the sliding dovetails. This gives me a fairly accurate place to drill for threaded inserts. These inserts are what I had the most trouble with. I started out too small on the drilled holes for them, which was not the best move with this really hard wood. As a result, I had one crack on me while I was trying to install it. I'm sure there's more than a few ways to remove a stuck or broken insert, but this is what I came up with in the moment. I ran some 5-minute epoxy onto the threads of a matching screw and waited for the epoxy to dry. This basically ruins the screw, but it gives an attachment point to remove the broken insert without damaging the wood, which was an obvious concern of mine. I drilled any others out with a larger hole from this point, of course. Oh, and I'd recommend waxing the threads, it helps a lot. These figure 8 clips are the second way I'll be attaching this slab to the top. They allow for wood movement, which is really important, as without accounting for such, the wood will just tear screws like these apart. You should really make sure the clip isn't totally tight when screwed down though, or it may not work properly. In accounting for wood movement, I also enlarged the furniture bolt holes. I chiseled these so that the bolts would be able to move back and forth and not up and down, but I seriously considered just drilling these larger in the future. I'm not sure all this extra effort was really worthwhile or necessary. I marked the screw holes with the clips in place and then removed the slab because it was in the way of the drill. When screwing into wood this hard, I always like to be more than careful because snapping a screw off inside the slab now would actually kill a piece of my soul. I wax the screw and then I drive it back and forth to cut threads without creating too much friction. I purchased this live edge offcut to make the other table legs with. It's more red gum to match the other base and the sliding dovetails. I mentioned previously that I think having too much live edge on the table would be bad for the design, so I'm going to remove most of this on these legs. I bought this piece for the legs despite the live edge because it had good grain orientation for table legs. Cut like this, the legs are rift sawn, where the grain runs at a 45-degree angle to all 4 faces. This gives each face of the leg uniform grain and minimizes any visual mismatch between the faces. Also, importantly to me, having the grain like this in the leg has a much lower risk of warping or twisting. Japanese saws can sometimes drift in the cut, so I purposely made sure the drift here was exaggerated to the waist side. This means some more cleanup, but I'd much rather that than drifting into the table leg. I removed these corners to get a good face for joining the legs to the dovetails. I'll join these in part with a bolt through the dovetail, similar to the other base. My expression doesn't really show it, but I was happy with how everything lined up, so I took the dovetails out, put them under the drill press, and then set the holes for the furniture bolts. These bolts alone won't hold the legs in place. For that, I'll need an attachment method to the underside of the slabs. I kind of stole this idea for aligning the drill angle from how chairmakers often drill in a similar way for setting stool legs in a seat. I had such success with the figure 8 clips on the slab base for the table, I thought I could also use them for these legs, but that was simply asking too much of them. They provided way too much movement and the whole assembly would have suffered for it, so I was back to the drawing board. Before I changed the attachment of the legs, I knew I wouldn't be satisfied unless I patched the holes I'd already made for the figure 8 clips. This wasn't going to be an invisible fix, of course, but given where it ends up on the underside of the table, I think it may as well be. I'm going to attach the table legs with wooden plates that recess into the table underside. I used this washer and pencil trick to get a consistent gap around the plate, so any wood movement should be well accounted for. I removed most of the waste with a router, so the bottom of the holes would be fairly flat. For a clean reveal, I then cut the remaining material out by hand. The plates are bolted into the legs so they can be removed for flat packing, and the opposite sides of the plates then bolt into the table base. The bolt holes are slightly oversized, so the assembly can shift with wood movement. I'll say with a table like this, I'd prefer to do glued joinery for the whole assembly, but obviously that doesn't really work well for shipping. And also in terms of handing this over to someone else, I'm trying to make the assembly dead simple to understand and deal with. With the plates finished, the legs were now much more solidly attached. This table is so incredibly heavy, I decided it would be much easier to cut the legs to size while it was still upside down. I did my best to match the bubble and the level to a reading I had on the table underside for both legs, and then I made some adjustments when they were cut and closer to size. If there's any gap between the level and the legs at this point, it tells me that the legs are not in the same plane. I'm just replacing these washers because I painted all the hardware for this table black so that it wouldn't draw much attention. To finish the sliding dovetails, I need to glue in a cover piece at the entry point. I was aware that flushing the covers up and trying to match the intricate live edge grain pattern was just impossible. So instead I opted to actually have them stick out slightly and become a noticeable indication of the joinery beneath the table. I think I prefer the idea of this anyway, as it seems a shame to try and completely hide difficult joinery like this. When placing the covers, I used a piece of wood to act as a spacer, so there's a small gap between the cover and the sliding dovetail behind it. This just allows the joint some room for movement as the slab expands and contracts. I tried to remove as much glue squeeze out as possible before it dried though, because it's tricky to remove with this live edge texture otherwise. So this was a screw up. I forgot to put my brand and date on this piece before I flipped it, so now I have the unfortunate task of doing that on my back. It's always hard to judge how much to heat up the brand for different woods. Here I went a bit overkill because you only really get one shot at getting this right, and having the brand be cooler in my opinion is the worst option. In haste, I forgot to spray some water on the surface before branding, so there's more bleed to the burn than I would have liked. It still went pretty well though, considering I was on the floor, so can't complain. I'm using my favourite finish on this table, which is an equal 3 parts mix of pure tung oil, liquid beeswax and mineral turpentine. I think this offers the best mix of protection and repairability for a piece like this. It's also so simple to apply and of course brings out the character of the wood grain, deepening the colours without darkening or yellowing as much as boiled linseed over time. Tung oil is great because when it dries it polymerizes into a water resistant layer, almost like a film finish like a polyurethane or a varnish, but you can still fully feel the wood beneath it. I much prefer it to the petroleum products because it's totally natural and sustainable too. And in terms of repairs, it's also much better because you can simply sand back and reapply in sections where that doesn't really work with the film finishes like polyurethane. I'll say the biggest downside to tung oil is you need patience. I leave days between coats and it will take weeks to fully cure. But the protection gained in the curing process over other oils is well worth it. It should also require much fewer and less frequent maintenance coats to other oils. Oh, but don't buy too much of this oil as it can have a temperamental shelf life. I had been absolutely dying to see this tabletop oiled up. I could just tell based on the grain it would be pretty remarkable. I could be wrong, I'm no expert, but I think all these waves through the wood are medullary rays, which make the slab reflect light so nicely. The whole table basically shimmers as you walk around it, and the oil only intensifies this quality. I could see these even in the rough condition of the slabs when I purchased them, and I knew getting to this point would be a real treat. What's great too is that as the oil soaks in and cures, the depth of the grain will only get richer, so while it's looking incredible now, it will settle into some even more pleasant tones. In terms of application for tung oil, wiping on is perfectly suitable. I find a brush works better in the rough spots though. But what is really important is that you come back and buff off the excess oil with a clean rag after about 10 minutes, or the finish may dry with streaks in it. I have this table listed for sale on my website. If you're interested or just want to see more of it, I'll leave a link. I'll shut up because I think these final shots should speak for themselves, but I'll quickly ask that if you've enjoyed this, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe, and if you do, well, thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.